Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history. It's a pleasure to have you with us again. Today we're traveling back to a very specific moment in time, a moment where the air was thick with heat and anxiety. London, August 1914.
It's a city and really a world holding its breath. We tend to look back at the outbreak of the First World War as something inevitable, a landslide that no one could stop.
Of course. The dominoes fall, Archduke Ferdinand is shot, alliances click into place, and the guns fire.
Exactly. But when you look at the documents, particularly what was happening inside number 10 Downing Street, you realize just how close Britain came to, well, to stepping back from the edge.
And that's the premise of today's deep dive. We're looking at a world where the British cabinet, which was deeply, deeply split, decided against intervention.
Right.
We're going to unpack this in three parts for you. First, the decision itself, how the logic of the wallet beat the logic of war in that cabinet.
And the consequences.
Yes. Second, the immediate and frankly violent consequences of that decision across Europe and, crucially, at home. And third, the long-term reality of a world where Britain is wealthy, neutral, but, well, living in the shadow of a German superpower.
It is a fascinating, if somewhat chilling trajectory. And to understand it, we have to start inside the room.
Hi.
August 2nd to August 4th, 1914. There's a common misconception that Britain was legally bound to fight for France because of the Entente Cordiale.
Right, the Entente. It's a term that gets thrown around in high school history books. It sounds very formal, very binding.
It does, but Entente really just means understanding. It wasn't a military alliance like the one Germany had with Austria-Hungary, which was an ironclad guarantee of support.
So it was more like a gentleman's agreement.
You could say that. It was essentially a series of agreements to settle colonial disputes in Africa and Asia. It was diplomatic housekeeping. Now, Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, they argued it was a moral obligation.
Of course they did.
They believed that if Britain stood aside, France would be crushed and Britain would be left friendless.
But they weren't the only voices in the room. And this is where that inevitability myth just falls apart.
Far from it. The cabinet was composed of, about 21 to 23 ministers, and the split was profound. You had powerful figures like John Morley and John Burns, who historically did resign, arguing that this was simply not Britain's fight.
The keepers of the Gladstonian flame, you could say.
That's it. The Gladstonian flame being peace, free trade, and staying out of continental messiness.
Exactly.
Their view was that Britain was an island empire. Its strength came from commerce, not from getting bogged down in the mud of European politics. But the pivot point in our timeline and in real history is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George.
Ah, the man who holds the purse strings.
The man who holds the purse strings and, crucially, the man who leads the radical wing of the party. In our history, the German invasion of Belgium, the violation of that scrap of paper, the 1839 Treaty of London, gave Lloyd George the moral cover he needed to support the war.
It let him sell the war to the public as a crusade for justice.
Yes. But Lloyd George was also a pragmatist, a survivor.
He was.
And in this history otherwise, we imagine that the economic arguments they outweigh the moral ones. Lloyd George looks at the numbers, not the treaties. In 1913, Britain's total imports were $522.2 million. That's a staggering sum for the time.
A huge sum.
Germany was a massive trading partner. He argues that war would cause the collapse of global credit and, ruin the city of London.
Commerce over honor.
That is the slogan. He paints a vision of Britain as a wealthy, neutral profiteer. He tells the cabinet, while the continental powers bleed themselves dry, we will be the workshop and the banker for the world.
And that argument works.
It works because the Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith, is primarily concerned with political survival. He knows that if he declares war, the peace faction led by Lloyd George creates a mutiny that brings down his government.
But if he chooses neutrality,
he keeps the party together. So faced with a choice between war and his own political survival, Asquith chooses survival. He accepts the resignations of Grey and Churchill. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declares armed neutrality.
So the lamps aren't going out all over Europe,
Wow.
or at least in London. They're just being dimmed slightly to count the money. But across the channel, things are moving very, very fast.
Unbelievably fast.
Let's talk about the military reality. We often hear about the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. They were small compared to the French or German armies, right?
Tiny. We're talking about 247,432 regulars. In a war of millions, that sounds like a rounding error. But they were the only fully professional army in Europe. They were incredibly well trained.
The old contemptibles.
That's them. In our timeline, they delayed the Germans at the Battle of Mons. Their rapid rifle fire was so intense, the Mad Minute they called it, 15 aimed rounds in 60 seconds, that the Germans thought they were facing machine guns.
And that delay was crucial.
It was everything.
Yeah.
That delay bought the French time to regroup for the Miracle of the Marne, which stopped the German advance and, set up the trench stalemate we all know.
But without the BEF.
Without the BEF, there is no delay. There's no speed bump.
Yeah.
The German First Army under General von Kluck has an open road. They execute the Schlieffen Plan as intended.
The Schlieffen Plan. Let's just break that down for a moment. This was the German master strategy, right? All about speed.
Yes. It relied on a massive, rapid wheeling motion through Belgium and northern France to encircle Paris from the west. It had to be fast. In our history, the British slowed down the tip of that spear.
And in this timeline?
In this timeline, the spear strikes home. The French left flank collapses. There is no Miracle of the Marne. By late September 1914, German troops are marching down the Champs-Élysées. Paris falls. The French government flees to Bordeaux.
That is a terrifyingly swift collapse.
Yes.
It sounds almost like 1940, but happening 26 years early.
That's a very good comparison. It is a war of movement that never solidifies into trenches because one side loses before they can dig in. And this collapse is compounded by the naval situation. This is the other half of the British absence.
The Royal Navy. The dreadnoughts.
Precisely. In our history, the Royal Navy used its 29 dreadnoughts to establish a distant blockade of Germany. They slowly strangled the German economy.
The turnip winter.
Exactly. It led to the turnip winter of 1916, where Germans were starving. It crippled their industrial output.
But in this scenario, the Royal Navy stays in Scapa Flow. They're just watching.
They're patrolling their own waters, but they are not stopping trade. And this is vital. American ships carrying cotton, oil, copper, and food sail right into Hamburg. Germany isn't starved out. They have the resources to finish the job in the west and then immediately turn east.
To Russia.
Russia usually collapses in 1917 due to internal exhaustion. Here, with France defeated by early 1915, Germany moves its elite divisions east much sooner. Russia faces the full, undivided brunt of the German war machine. The Tsarist regime collapses by 1916.
So we are looking at a total German victory. Not a negotiated peace, but a conquest.
A total victory. The Treaty of Brussels establishes what they called Mitteleuropa, a German-dominated economic and political union stretching from the English Channel to the Caucasus.
Meanwhile, back in Britain, there's peace. The guns are silent. But the sources suggest it's a very fragile, paradoxical peace. You mentioned earlier that peace abroad leads to violence at home.
Yes. This is the twist that people often miss when discussing British neutrality. In our history, the outbreak of WWI acted as a unifying force. It was a pressure valve. Everyone rallied around the flag.
Right, and the huge domestic crisis, the Irish Home Rule crisis, was just put on hold for the duration.
Exactly. But without a foreign war to unify them.
The pressure cooker explodes.
It does. The Home Rule Act, which would give Ireland self-governance, is on the books. But the Protestants in the north, the Unionists, are violently opposed to it. Sir Edward Carson, their leader, doesn't go to London to support the war effort. He goes to Belfast to mobilize the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF.
And the Irish volunteers mobilize in response.
It's a powder keg. And the British government is paralyzed. You have to remember the Curragh incident earlier in 1914, where British officers basically threatened to resign rather than fight against the Unionists.
So the army itself is politically unreliable on this.
Deeply. That paralysis turns fatal here. A full-scale sectarian civil war erupts in Ulster. The British government has to deploy troops, the very troops that would have been in Flanders, to act as peacekeepers or oppressors in their own country.
That is bitter irony. Britain avoids the mud of Flanders, only to have its young men fighting urban warfare in Belfast and Derry.
And it tears the social fabric apart. You have atrocities on both sides, refugees streaming into Liverpool and Glasgow. Britain is peaceful in terms of international law, but internally, it is fracturing.
And yet, if we look at the ledger, economically, the country is booming. Lloyd George's vision of the wealthy neutral comes true, doesn't it?
On paper, yes. Britain becomes the arsenal of the world. The shipyards on the Clyde and Tyne are building merchant ships for everyone. The steel mills are running 247. The City of London is funding both Berlin and Paris. A river of gold flows into the country.
But I imagine that wealth isn't exactly trickling down.
Not at all. This is the era of the Great Unrest, the massive strikes of 1910 to 1914. In our timeline, The war paused that class conflict. Here, it returns with a vengeance.
So the working class sees food prices soaring because of continental demand, and they see the factory owners building grand estates.
And there's a moral cost to this. I mean, selling goods to Germany while they're occupying Paris, that's got to sit uncomfortably with the average Briton.
It must create a deep national shame.
It does. They're called the merchants of death. British ships are carrying goods that help the German war machine. For the British public, who still have a lot of cultural sympathy for the French, this is morally repugnant. It deepens the class divide.
And the government can't appeal to patriotism to stop strikes, can they?
How could they? They aren't fighting a war for survival. They are just protecting profits.
So we have a wealthy, divided Britain watching a German superpower rise across the Channel. Let's look at the long-term geopolitical shape of this world. We often talk about splendid isolation as a British strategy. What does that look like in the 1920s and 30s of this timeline?
It looks less like splendid isolation and more like a trap. Britain is wealthy, but it is terrified. The strategic nightmare has come true. For centuries, British foreign policy had one goal: prevent a single power from dominating the European coast.
And now, the Channel ports places like Antwerp and Calais are effectively under the control of a hostile German superpower.
Exactly. The invasion scare never really goes away. It becomes a permanent state of mind. We enter a 20-year Cold War, but instead of capitalism versus communism, it's sea power versus land power, Britain versus Germany.
And because of that threat, Britain has to maintain a massive military.
A massive one. Conscription, which Britain hated and resisted for so long, becomes permanent. They are armed to the teeth, staring across the water.
It's interesting because usually we associate the 1920s in Britain with a certain post-war exhaustion, a desire to disarm. But here, the tension never breaks.
No, the tension actually escalates. The Royal Navy has to be larger than ever because the German high seas fleet is now operating out of Brest and Cherbourg on the French coast. The strategic depth of the Channel is gone.
And what about the empire? Usually we think of WWI as the moment the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand proved their loyalty and forged their identities.
In this timeline, the empire begins to unravel much faster. The Dominions feel betrayed. You have to understand the psychology. They see the mother country abandoning plucky little Belgium and leaving France to its fate.
It shatters the idea of British moral leadership.
Completely.
So no ANZ legend.
No, there's no Gallipoli. That forge of national identity for Australia and New Zealand never happens. Instead of looking to Britain with reverence, they start looking at her with suspicion. They start turning towards the United States much earlier for security and trade.
And South Africa. I read that was quite a dramatic shift.
Yes. In reality, there was a rebellion by Afrikaner nationalists, the Maritz Rebellion, at the start of the war. It was crushed because the government was strong and united. But here, with Britain looking weak and selfish, the rebellion succeeds. South Africa drifts away from the empire decades early.
It seems like Britain keeps the money but loses the influence. Speaking of influence, what happens to the relationship with the United States?
The special relationship essentially never exists. In our history, that bond was forged in the trenches and cemented in WWII. Here, the U.S. stays neutral too. They sell to everyone. They become the world's creditor, just like in our timeline, but they view Britain as a cynical rival, not an ally.
So the American century still happens.
It happens faster, and it's more isolationist. The U.S. looks at Europe as a mess of tyrannies and monarchies and decides to stay out of it. There is no NATO in this future.
I want to touch on a slightly strange detail that came up in the research. The royal family.
Ah, yes, the House of Windsor.
Or rather, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha.
Exactly. We forget that King George V changed the family name to Windsor in 1917, specifically because of anti-German sentiment during the war. He wanted to sound less German.
In this timeline, that pressure doesn't exist.
So he keeps the German name, but the dynamic with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, is completely inverted.
Because Wilhelm isn't the exiled villain chopping wood in the Netherlands. He wins.
Wilhelm becomes the dominant monarch of Europe. Imagine the scene. King George V has to host a state visit for his cousin, the triumphant German emperor. The British monarchy is secure at home. There's no post-war revolution. But on the world stage, they're playing second fiddle to the Hohenzollerns. It is a humiliation.
It paints such a vivid picture of a country that is physically intact but psychologically diminished. We've painted a picture of a world that is stable in some ways, no trenches, no Somme, but incredibly tense in others. We're coming to the end of our deep dive, and we have to ask the big question, the reckoning. How do we balance the books on this?
It is the ultimate ledger of history. On the credit side, you have life, pure and simple. 900,000 British men did not die. The lost generation wasn't lost.
Poets like Wilfred Owen lived to write into their middle age. There are no war memorials in every village green listing the names of the fallen.
That is a massive gain. It's hard to argue against the value of nearly 1 million lives. That's 1 million fathers, husbands, inventors, teachers.
It is. But look at the debit side.
Well, on the debit side, Britain is richer in men and money, but it has lost its soul and its security. It lives in a state of perpetual fear. It's isolated. It's facing a totalitarian German superstate just 20 miles across the water.
And likely facing a second war eventually.
Almost certainly. But a different war. A war between the German Empire and, say, the Soviet Union. And Britain would be stuck on the sidelines, trying to decide whether to support the Kaiser they fear or the communists they hate.
It really reframes the decision made in that cabinet room. We often ask if WWI was worth it, given the horror. But this scenario suggests the alternative wasn't peace. It was just a different kind of danger.
That is the crux of it. The choice wasn't between war and peace. It was between sacrifice for security and comfort with danger.
In our timeline, Britain sacrificed a generation to prevent German domination.
And in this timeline, they save the generation but accept the domination.
And end up living in Britannia's shadow.
Precisely. A comfortable secondary existence. A wealthy spectator to history rather than a participant.
It is a thought that will stick with me. Sometimes the path not taken is just as treacherous as the one we walked.
History is fragile. It turns on a single decision in a single room.
Thank you for unpacking this with us. It's been a fascinating journey into the what if.
My pleasure.
Join us next time on The Deep Dive.